All right, so welcome to the Craft of Writing session. A lot of the sessions at ONA tend to focus more on technology and web-related tools, but one of my former colleagues and I, Roy Peter Clark, really wanted to focus on the craft of writing because writing is integral to every role in the newsroom and every role in online journalism. And I'm going to talk about the ways in which it's integral throughout the course of this talk. So my name is Mallory Tenori. I'm the Assistant Director of the Knight Center for Journalism in the Americas, which is, we've got some fans, which is at UT Austin, so I didn't have much of a commute, which was nice. And we're basically a journalism outreach program for journalists around the world who want training. So we offer online courses on digital trends and tools, and we also have an international symposium on online journalism every April here in Austin. So we like to modestly say it's the best journalism conference in the world, but ONA is obviously amazing too. ISOJ is a smaller conference, but it's focused on digital tools and trends in the industry. So I want to welcome you all here today. I was going to be teaching this session with my longtime friend, Roy Peter Clark, but unfortunately the hurricane derailed his travel plans, so he is not here today. He sends his regrets, but many of the tips and tools that I'll be sharing are inspired by Roy and his teachings. Roy is a longtime writing coach from the Poynter Institute for Media Studies, a journalism think tank that trains journalists from around the world. I used to work at Poynter, was editor of their website, so I'm a big Poynter fan myself. And Roy has often been called the godfather of writing and the craft of writing. And it just so happens that he's also the godfather to my 2-year-old daughter, Madeline. So he's missed, but I'll be channeling him throughout this session today. So just to survey the room a little bit, how many of you would consider yourselves writers or reporters in your newsrooms? Okay, so a lot of you. How about visual journalists, videographers, photographers? Okay, great. How about data journalists? Okay, a couple. Nice, thank you for attending. And so it's great that many of you are writers, but like I said, these tools will be really helpful regardless of your role in the newsroom. And for some of you, this may be kind of a battery recharge. You may know some of these tips and tools. For others, they may be totally new. So my hope is that this session will be relevant for all of you. And I'm going to be referring to these as tips and tools throughout the session because I don't like to think about it in terms of rules. When I think of rules, I think of things that are very rigid and things that you're beholden to. If we tend to frame them in terms of tools and tips, I think it's easier because you can think about different ways that you might be able to embrace them at various points of the reporting and storytelling process. So in terms of tips and tools, the handout that I gave you lists about 50 different writing tools from Roy's Writing Tools book. So it's a good just go-to guide for you. I have one in my office at work that I like to refer to for some inspiration. So this will be a good, helpful tip sheet for you. So some of the things I'm going to be going over today are how you can become a more compelling, interesting, comprehensible, and faster writer. Okay, so I'm going to break down these tips in terms of different questions. The first one being this: how can I make my work more compelling and interesting? So first tip, which is one of my favorites, is get the name of the dog. How many of you have heard of this before? Okay, so some of you. So get the name of the dog literally can be translated into get the name of the pet of the family or the person you're interviewing, right? So if you're reporting a story, there's an animal, get that animal's name because that name could be a very integral and important detail to your story that can add color and life to it. It's also kind of an analogy for a larger point about needing to get detail at a granular level when you're reporting because all those small details add up to a stronger, richer piece. And there's a lot of great examples of journalists who have done a good job of getting the dog's name, so to speak. And one of my favorite examples comes from the Tampa Bay Times by a longtime reporter who has since left the Times named Rick Bragg. And he's a master of feature writing. And he wrote this story about this chicken that was eaten or about to be eaten by a bobcat in the city of Dunedin, Florida. And so I just want to read this to you because I think it's a good example of this tip. It says, Mopsy has looked into the face of death, and it is whiskered. Mopsy is a pet chicken belonging to Winnie Bowman. Mrs. Bowman was on the porch of her Narnia Court home Wednesday morning when Mopsy came tearing around the corner of the house, feathers flying. Hot on Mopsy's tail feathers was a bobcat. I couldn't believe my eyes, Mrs. Bowman said. Mopsy made it to the house safely. The bobcat, feathers in its lawn whiskers, slinked into a nearby orange grove. Mrs. Bowman called the law. So this is a great piece of writing, right? I mean, this could have just not been a story to begin with. It could have been a very small news brief in a small local town, or it could have been this, a really great feature lead. And I love the detail. First, that he got the chicken's name. It's interesting that she has a pet chicken to begin with. And the fact that he wrote it so eloquently and well. And even that last line, she didn't call the police, she called the law, because this was a big deal. The other important thing is to think about the crucial difference between reports and stories. So very often, these two terms get conflated. So we tend to think about reports and stories and kind of muddle them all into one. But there is a distinct difference between the two. So this is a little chart that breaks down those differences. So a reporter, or a report rather, points you to information. A story puts you there through an experience. So when you think about a report, you think, okay, a report is this breaking news report that gives you the facts, follows the typical inverted pyramid, and it imparts information. It points you there. It answers all the who, what, when, where, why, if possible, and how. Stories, on the other hand, render experience. They put you in that place. They reenact scenes. The who becomes a character. So that chicken became Mopsy, a character in the story. What becomes a scenic action. So as the reporter, you're reporting scenes and actions. And we'll get into that in a little bit. Where becomes a setting, where the reporter actually paints a picture of what this setting in the story looks like. When becomes chronology, so thinking about how things happened and in what order. Why becomes motive. And how becomes how it happened, so digging deeper into that big grandiose question of how. And so the best stories include both stories and reports. Okay, so you can go back and forth between the two. Sometimes you might just be writing a report, but very often you can put the two together. So again, pointing the reader there, putting the reader there, or both. Now this is a good example from the Chronicle of Higher Education that looks at how you can marry those two things. So this was a story that was published a few years back about a young woman who was held captive by rebel groups in Sudan. And she really wanted to be able to break free from that and go to college. So this was a story about her transformation, how she moved from this rebel group to going to college to study journalism. It says, when Akala Grace Grawl woke up, she could feel the cool night air in her face, but she couldn't move. Most of her body was under sand. Where was her gun? If she'd lost it, her commander in the Lord's Resistance Army would beat her up. As she dragged herself out of the shallow grave, everything that had happened that day came back to her. In sub-Saharan Africa, only 1/4 of the students enrolled in post-secondary education are women, according to a World Bank estimate from the mid-90s. About 60% of American women live a life that consists of working the land and raising children. So in that first paragraph, you see you have a story that puts you there and is experiential. In the second one, it's more of a report that's giving you statistics, using language like according to. So you can see throughout this story, she sort of wove in story elements into her report. And as I'm going through this, if you all have any questions, let me know, but we'll also try to save some time at the end for questions. Another important thing to think about is news may come first, but key elements go at the end. So a lot of times whenever I'm reading a story, I'm kind of a nerd in this sense, but I like to look at the white space in a story. So I look to see, okay, what is the white space in between paragraphs, at the end of sentences? And I always notice the last word at the end of a paragraph or sentence, because those words pop, right? So the average reader may not be looking at a story critically in that way and thinking, oh, those are very strong key words at the end. But overall, if you put key important words at the end of your sentences and paragraphs, it improves the overall quality of the content. So this is a classic example, one that Roy often uses in his teaching, and it comes from Shakespeare's play Macbeth, which is probably the shortest and bloodiest of all of Shakespeare's works. And this very simple line is, "The queen, my lord, is dead." Now, Shakespeare could have written this in any variety of ways, right? Could have said, "My lord, the queen is dead." "The queen is dead, my lord." Or if he wanted to channel his inner Yoda, he could have said, "Dead the queen is, my lord." And so as you think about this, what do you think makes that one on the left so much more poignant? Anybody? Yeah? Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah. Yes, so raising anticipation. Anybody else? Yeah, exactly. So that word dead is the most important word in that sentence. So that appears at the end. And then my lord, that's in the middle. And those commas act as just little speed bumps, right? They slow you down as the reader. And so that gives you pause before you get to this, important information at the end. And I like to share this example because it shows that, one, good writing doesn't always have to be long. Sometimes some of the best writing is short. And also because it's a good example of emphatic word order, thinking about how you can put important and compelling words at the end of sentences. Another tip is spread gold coins along the way. So often as writers, we kind of agonize over our leads, right? We spend a lot of time thinking about how am I going to start off this story. We might also think about how am I going to end this story. So a lot of writers will try to kind of map that out and put a lot of emphasis on the beginning and the end, but then we sometimes forget about the middle, right? And so this applies to whether you're writing longer stories or a short news report. A lot of times we lose readers in the middle, and especially as we think about people competing for different attention spans. I mean, there's so many different news sources out there. And so if you spread gold coins throughout your story, you're more likely to kind of keep those readers involved and engaged. So a gold coin might be a really interesting quote. It might be a description of a scene. It might help lay out a characteristic or a setting from wherever you're reporting. So just think about that. It's somewhat gimmicky, but I used to have a little bag of gold coins, the chocolate ones on my desk, just as a reminder to think about spreading those gold coins throughout my stories. And it was helpful. So another good tip is thinking about capturing strong scenes and quotes. So strong scenes and quotes should always add to a story, right? Sometimes I'll read a story and I think, man, this quote was totally not necessary, right? It was basically describing something that the writer could have described in their own words, or it was just kind of a cliched throwaway phrase. So one of the masters of dialogue and quotes and scenes is Kelly Benham French, who used to work at the Tampa Bay Times, now is a teacher at Indiana University. And she wrote this story about this man from Colombia who had come to the US after being kidnapped and robbed in Colombia. And he was a magician in Colombia. And he came to the US, got a job at Walmart. Kelly was writing about his journey. And she had a translator with her. She didn't speak Spanish. And so that language barrier could have been a really big barrier in terms of being able to write a good, compelling story. But because that barrier was there in terms of language, she wanted to think about, well, how do I make the story come to life through the scenes that I'm seeing with my eyes? So she wrote this out. She said, he takes out his cards. Remember, he's a magician. Here is the 7 of diamonds on the table. It represents land, say a farm in a small Colombian village with a peasant family living on it. The paramilitaries, he picks up another card, want the land so they can plant coca. Cesar puts that card on the top first. The guerrillas want it for their own drug crops. He piles on another card. The drug cartels want it. Another card. What happens to the people on the farm? They're buried under the pile. Maybe the paramilitaries take the family's oldest son and threaten to kill the whole family if he resists. Then the guerrillas get word that the family supports the paramilitaries. And then, muerte, Cesar says. Muerte, understand? And muerte in Spanish means death. And so she said that she had lots of notes with the different translations, but that one word, muerte, was so powerful, and she was able to include that in his own language, and it held a lot of weight on its own. So this was a great example of how you can use a scene to really empower your storytelling, and how powerful quotes don't have to be long and drawn out. Sometimes they can be 1 or 2 words. Another interesting thing is thinking about putting odd and interesting things next to each other. So juxtaposition is a really good tool to have in your toolbox as a writer. And I've seen different examples of this. One comes from a young reporter named Erin Baldassari from the East Bay Times, and she was part of the Pulitzer Prize-winning team who worked on reporting of the warehouse fire in Oakland, California a couple years ago. And so this was the lead to her story about this, and it's a pretty long sentence. Sometimes long sentences can get tricky, right? They seem loaded or maybe run-ons, but this one worked. And so it says, doomed partygoers trapped on the second floor of a crudely converted warehouse screamed, help us, as one of the deadliest structure fires in Oakland's history ripped through a tinderbox of makeshift living spaces and a labyrinth cluttered with art late Friday night, killing at least 24 people and possibly more. So there's a whole lot going on in that lead sentence, right? But it works. You have the dialogue, the quote, the help us, which is simple but so filled with emotion and that sense of desperation that these people were feeling as they were trying to flee the warehouse. You have alliteration with the crudely converted, and you have things that are odd and interesting placed next to each other. So in that one sentence, you have partygoers, you have art, you have death, you have a labyrinth. There's a lot of different things that are sort of odd and interesting together that add to the overall strength of that lead sentence. So just to recap, these are some of the points about getting the name of the dog, understanding reports versus stories, pointing the reader there, putting the reader there, or both. The news may come first, but you want to put powerful words at the end. Spread those gold coins around so that you can captivate people and hold their attention throughout a story, which is especially important in online news. Capturing those strong scenes and quotes that really add weight and value and depth to a story, and including juxtaposition by placing odd and interesting things next to each other. So next question, how can I become a more comprehensible writer? So we are all moving around the world really quickly these days, right? And always busy, always doing something, and sometimes that is reflected in our writing. And so as writers, we want to think about how do we speed up the flow of information when need be, and how do we slow it down sometimes too, which I think we sometimes focus on the speeding up part of it, especially in newsrooms today, and we lose sight of the importance of slowing down information for people. And there are key ways that you can slow it down, so to speak, as a writer. So Eli Saslow, one of my favorite reporters, he works at the Washington Post. He won a Pulitzer Prize for some reporting that he did on Newtown. So he wrote a piece called Into the Lonely Quiet, in which he looked at how grieving parents who had lost children in the Newtown shootings were finding resiliency and learning to find meaningful pathways forward. And it was a really poignant piece. It was a good example of what is called restorative narrative, which is basically a genre of storytelling that looks at how people are finding pathways forward and how they're finding resilience and the strength to move on after difficult times. So it's sort of a genre that looks at that murky middle between what happened and those first-year anniversary stories that are often surface level. So really good piece, and this was a passage from it. Basically, he was in this place, I think they were in the house, and they were looking at the different parents who were about to take a moment of silence for their children who had died in the shootings. And he wrote, Marquez Green listened to the names and pictured her daughter dressed for school that last day. Pudgy cheeks, curly hair, and a t-shirt decorated with sequin purple peace sign, a piece Marquez Green was still promising to deliver to her daughter every night when she prayed to her memory and whispered, love wins. The gavel banged. The moments of silence ended. The parents sat back in their chairs. And so I always get a little choked up whenever I read this story as a mom of a 1-year-old and 2-year-old. But I love the writing in this. And in that first paragraph, you can really almost visualize what this mom is thinking. She's thinking about her daughter. She's thinking about the memory of her daughter and that peace that she's trying to find amid chaos. And then all of a sudden, that moment of silence ends. That gavel bangs, that silence ends, and the parents sit back down. And so we see here that he's playing with that sort of pace of the information. So all of a sudden, speeds up, slows down. And so I think it's a really good example of how you can control the pace. And you'll see too that love wins, how that's at the end of that paragraph. That's powerful, right? So again, emphatic word order. And one of the things about this last sentence is that it makes really good use of punctuation. So I like to think about the period as a stop sign. So to kind of carry out this analogy, you can think about a sentence as a road, and at the end of that road is the period, the stop sign, right? So the stop sign is what gives readers pause. So this sentence, at the end, these three sentences could have easily been one sentence, right? But because they're broken up into three sentences, it makes us think. It makes us focus on each word a little bit more. And it makes each sentence have more weight. So punctuation can be really powerful in terms of the period. You can think about commas as being kind of speed bumps. So going back to that example of the queen, comma, my lord, comma, is dead. You can think about colons as sort of, flashing yellow lights that are telling you that something important is coming up. And Don Fry, a longtime writing coach who has since passed away, he used to call dashes branches in the road because he felt like dashes were super overused and just made it difficult for people to travel down that path. So as you think about punctuation, think about how you can use it purposefully. And there's a great book that Roy wrote called The Glamour of Grammar, which sort of looks at punctuation and the different ways in which you can use it to strengthen your storytelling and your writing. But I'm mentioning this because a lot of times as writers, we don't necessarily think about the weight that punctuation can hold because we take advantage of it. We use punctuation all the time. But actually, it can strengthen our writing when used well. So another tip is consider using you to make the text feel more conversational. I was teaching this session to some students at UT earlier today, and they were all like, well, you're not supposed to use you in writing, but obviously you can when done well, and sometimes when using it, it actually makes the piece either more relatable or conversational. So another example from Kelly Benham, you can tell I really like her writing. She wrote a piece called Never Let Go. It was a 3-part series in the Tampa Bay Times, and it was about her daughter, who was a micro-preemie. She was born right on the cusp of the age of viability, which is 24 weeks. And her daughter, Juniper, was 23 weeks and 6 days. Had very, very low chance of surviving, but she actually is alive and well today, a young girl with a lot of spunk and charisma. So this story ultimately had a happy ending. But I really like how she used you in various parts of this piece, which actually later ended up becoming a book called Juniper. But she says, I clutched a syringe containing a trace amount of milk, her breast milk. I had run out a few drops and collected them in the syringe like you'd use to feed an orphaned squirrel. She was alien and familiar. She was terrifying and beautiful. She was complete and interrupted. I felt the icy hush that comes with looking at a secret you are not meant to see. I was peeking into God's pocket. And there's a lot of good writing that takes place here, right? So you can see that juxtaposition with the odd and interesting things that I was telling you about. Alien and familiar, right? Those two things don't typically go together. Terrifying and beautiful. Complete and interrupted. So that's a really good example of the juxtaposition. And also you'll notice about that, there's 3 distinct sentences that are descriptors, right? So in writing, 3 is the magic number. So 2 is not quite enough, 4 is too much and too many. But 3 is typically that sweet spot. So you see this play out in different ways, right? Sex, drugs, rock and roll, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, bada bing, bada boom. Bada boom at the end is different, right? Sometimes it helps in that third one to add a little twist at the end. And you think about that emphatic word order again. So 3, always keep that in mind as you're writing. It's a way to strengthen some of your writing by using that magic number. And so again, this has a lot of different elements of that. And alliteration at the end with that peeking pocket. Yeah.
Was that a column or a news story written in news feature, written in first person?
So it was a news feature that was written in first person. Yeah, so it was a 3-part series that ran in the Times, and then it became the basis of the book called Juniper. So another tip, keep subject and verb together near the beginning of a sentence, which is pretty simple, but it's not something that we always think about as a writer. And one thing for you all to be keeping in mind is that There are a lot of different tools that I'm going over here, and you're not going to obviously use every tool for every story. You may not remember them all, but the more you think about these things, the more you can figure out when it makes sense to use them, and they ultimately are going to improve the quality of your writing. So how many of you know Jackie Bunashinsky? Anybody? Okay. So she is a longtime friend of mine and a great, great writer. She actually just joined the Neiman Storyboard at Harvard University. And prior to that, she was at Mizzou teaching, and then she was at the St. Paul Pioneer Press. She won a Pulitzer in the late 1980s for this piece that she wrote called AIDS in the Heartland. It was about a man, Dick Hansen, who was gay and had AIDS, and he was a farmer in Missouri and a political activist. And her writing is beautiful. I would encourage you to look up AIDS in the Heartland. The full version of it is available online, even though it was published years and years ago. But I just want to read this to you as an example. And it says, in the year that Dick Hansen has been living and dying with AIDS, he has hosted some cruel companions, blinding headaches and failing vision, relentless nausea and deep fatigue, falling blood counts and worrisome coughs and sleepless sweat-soaked nights. He has watched as his strong body, toughened by 37 years on the farm, shrinks and stoops like that of an old man. He has weathered the family shame and community fear, the prejudice and whispered condemnations. He has read the reality in his partner's eyes, heard the death sentence from the doctors, and seen the hopelessness confirmed by the statistics. So again, we have subject verb, and we have that magic number 3 too, right? He has watched, he has weathered, he has read. And one of the things you'll notice is that, I don't know about you, but I always like to collect good pieces of writing. And so I often find that a lot of these tools are evidence in really good writing. Whether or not the writer is cognizant of it, I think a lot of times they are. But the more you kind of collect good pieces of writing, the more you'll be able to identify some of these tips and techniques. So Mario Garcia is a longtime news designer. He often talks about lifting out the heavy cargo in stories. And I think a lot of times we kind of deal with numeric novocation, as I like to call it, in stories, because sometimes you read this story and it's filled with numbers that just totally bog down the story, right? And it's confusing to follow. It just makes it difficult to comprehend because numbers can be confusing. And so you want to be able to add context to those numbers, but you also want to ask yourself, is there a way that we can maybe lift some of these numbers out or explain them better in a map or a chart or a graph? And this is another reason why it's so important to be working with other people in the newsroom from the beginning of the storytelling and reporting process, so that you can be thinking about creative ways to enhance your storytelling rather than bogging it down with information that may slow down the reader or ultimately confuse the reader. So how many of you read your stories out loud? Yeah? Okay. What is it about reading out loud that helps you as a writer? Yep.
You can see whether or not you've developed a rhythm.
Mm-hmm.
You can better understand how it's going to affect the reader. And it just gives you a sense of when you read, you can miss things. But if you say it out loud, you're less likely to miss things. What I do at the end is I read from the bottom up. So because I got used to reading from the top down to find out stuff. Because I read every sentence from the bottom up, and I get all those grammatical punctuation stuff correct.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that, the idea of reading from the bottom up. That's really interesting. And I agree with you about the rhythm aspect of it. You kind of catch the rhythm and you catch more mistakes too if you read it out loud. Yeah?
I agree with Mary. I do it for rhythm, finding a potential for a different voice in my own head, putting myself in the shoes of maybe a fictional reader who I'm not considering in my writing style, and just seeing what their pacing might be like. It often helps me find a run-on sentence, which I'm a little bit prone to sometimes,
Yes.
just by hearing it out loud, and then you kind of smack yourself on the head and move back on and fix it. But it's mostly a rhythm thing for me, although I've never read from the bottom up. So start doing it now.
Yeah, I may have to start trying that as well. Go ahead.
Something I like when I'm reading out loud is finding if there's a subject that I may have mentioned earlier in the story that I might want to bring back at the end. Kind of tie things in, even if it's a small detail. A lot of the times I feel the reader kind of picks back up on a small detail you mentioned in the top and kind of feel complete, or they kind of were curious about something that you may bring back into the story.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So just to reiterate, in case you couldn't hear, the idea that sometimes you might find a really good small detail up at the top that you may forget about if you're just skimming it and not reading it out loud, but reading it out loud kind of solidifies it in your memory more, and you can think about ways to incorporate it perhaps at the end. Great, so I love reading stories out loud. I'm really excited to have an office now where I work as opposed to just being in a cubicle because I can shut the door and just start reading drafts out loud so I don't look like I'm crazily talking to myself. And I really like it because it has helped me to develop my voice as a writer, and it helps you become more attuned to it. And like you guys were saying, it also helps you to catch mistakes in your writing, so there may be small prepositions and typos and things that are out of place. So it helps with that. And then also, too, sometimes I'll notice that I'll read a sentence out loud and I'm out of breath by the end of it. So I think, okay, this definitely needs to be broken up into a couple different sentences. So it's a strategy that can be really helpful in terms of identifying and strengthening your voice as a writer. I may have gone to sleep mode. Okay, so just to recap, how can I become a more comprehensible writer? Slow down that pace and vary it between fast and slow. Think about punctuation as being a stop sign or a speed bump. Consider using you so you can draw people in and make the text more conversational. Keep those subjects and verbs together toward the beginning of sentences. Lift out that heavy cargo into a map or chart or graph. And read drafts out loud so you can see if they sound okay to you. So how can I become a faster writer? For a long time, I used to think about the digital age, and I would often get this question of, well, how do I write for the web? And I always felt like I didn't have a great answer for it because I believe that no matter what platform you're writing for, you can always be a good writer, and these tools can apply to whether you're writing a script for a video, or you're writing on social media, or you're writing for a print column or a digital column, right? So good writing is good writing. But I think one of the tricks to writing for the web is learning how to write faster. Because of the digital age, we're constantly trying to get news and information out quickly via push alerts, or we're writing a breaking news story, we're publishing the information that we have and verified, and then we're adding to that story as news develops. So we have to think about how can we develop tools in our toolbox that will enable us to write more quickly and efficiently while still writing well. So how many of you guys are procrastinators in the room? Yes, I'm a big procrastinator as well. We're all deadline driven, right? We are in a deadline driven profession. We need those deadlines to help keep us on track, and many times we are procrastinating. And I think as writers, we tend to think about procrastination as being a vice rather than a virtue, but procrastination can actually work in our favor if we let it. So procrastination, the word comes from the Latin word cras, which means tomorrow. So sometimes you think, why write today when you could write tomorrow, right? And we find all these different ways to avoid writing. So maybe for some of us, we do Facebook surfing, or maybe we go out to get something to eat. I know for me, a lot of times I will go cleaning. I'll just start going on this cleaning frenzy or doing laundry when I'm supposed to be doing something else related to writing. And one of the ways that you can kind of think about procrastination is reframing it as rehearsal. So there are actually things that you can do to be helping yourself along in the writing process while you're so-called procrastinating. And I thought about this while reading a newsletter that Jackie Bunashinsky, who wrote that AIDS in the Heartland piece, puts out every Friday. So she just started this newsletter that's through the Neiman Storyboard, and it's all about good writing. It comes out on Fridays. And this was from last week's newsletter, and it just resonated with me because I said, yes, I can totally relate to that. She said, we had a brief reprieve from smoke-choked skies in Seattle yesterday, so I was cleaning. This photo is ash residue from the first swipe of a single windowsill, proof that we are fogged in by particulate, and proof that I was indeed cleaning. She's talking about the wildfires up there. She said, why clean on the first cool, fresh day in more than a week? Because air quality alerts warned against vacuuming during the worst of the inversion, because I like a clean house, and, well, because I was trying to write. For me, trying to write usually involves a whole lot of not writing, which usually involves a whole lot of cleaning. I tell myself that it's painful time in the writing process where I need to take time to find my focus. Sometimes that works. When it doesn't, at least I get the baseboards dusted. And so as she's scrubbing those baseboards, the wheels are turning, and she's thinking about the story that she wants to write. She's thinking about those interviews that she did. She's thinking about those key details, and she's formulating something in her head that will help her when she actually gets to her computer and starts typing. I find for myself that if it's not me cleaning, then usually I'm going for a walk or a run, and that's when I have my best thoughts. So I used to look at it as me procrastinating, but now I realize that when I am on deadline, I have a lot of nervous energy, and I can't just sit at my desk and think. I need to be moving, and so I'll usually go for a quick walk and then come back and think, okay, I've got this. I've got some thoughts in my head that I can actually start working with now. So reframe your thinking and don't be too hard on yourself if you're procrastinating. Think about it as a rehearsal. Another tip is don't report and then write. Write while you're reporting. So many of us tend to separate writing and reporting, and we think, okay, we have to do all of our reporting first, and then we do our writing after the fact. But the best storytellers integrate the two. So as you're reporting, you can think about writing out different pieces of the story. I often use the little notes app on my phone, and I use that to just keep track of things that I want to write as I'm doing my reporting. So that way, the writing process isn't divorced from the reporting process. Those two should really go hand in hand. Along these lines, try to find the focus of the work while you're in the field. So I think that writers write with their heads, their hearts, and their hands. But they also write with their feet, right? As writers, we need to go out and explore. We need to be out there in the field, finding the stories, thinking about them, and trying to figure out our focus. And so focus, for me, has always been one of the great challenges of writing. And a lot of times I'll ask myself, while I'm in the field, well, what is this story about? And then I fine-tune that. Once I have an answer to that, I think, well, what is this story really about? And sometimes the answer goes from a paragraph to a sentence at that point. And then I think, what is this story really, really about? And sometimes I can come up with one word that encompasses a story. You may not always have that one word, but I think if you can get it down to one sentence, then that is really helpful. And one of the things I try to think about as well is if I can't write a headline for a story or if I can't write a tweet about a story, then I haven't found that focus yet. I think if you can think about that headline and what it might be, then that will help you with that focus. Another idea is annotate your notes as you're taking them. So when I worked at the Poynter Institute, I covered the media industry. So I was basically writing stories about journalists and figuring out how they did what they did and the story behind the story. And one of the questions that I would always ask if I was able to interview them in person was whether or not I could see their notebooks. And I wasn't trying to look to see if they got the quotes correct. I was really just interested in seeing how they took their notes. And it was fascinating to see how some people really annotated their notes quite carefully. Some people I interviewed still used an old steno pad, and they would use little brackets or asterisks, or they would color code them. So sometimes they would put a star next to a really good scene, or they would put circles around really good dialogues. Other times they would color code different potential leads. And so every writer has their own system for doing this, but the extent to which you can think about annotating your notes during the reporting process as opposed to after is really helpful. And even after the fact, it can be helpful, right? But this will enable you, once you start writing, to actually write more faster, more quickly, and more efficiently. Write earlier than you think you can, what we call zero drafting. How many of you have heard of zero drafting? Okay, so it's a relatively new term for you guys. So zero drafting, I like to keep in mind because a lot of times the idea of a first draft can seem daunting sometimes. Other times we may just not have time to actually write out a first draft because of deadline constraints. And so zero drafting is where you basically are thinking about key elements of your story and you're scribbling them down. So you're not setting out to write a whole first draft or even the second draft. You're just thinking about what are some of the key elements I need to get down now that will help me to actually write this story. And so I know some people who will write out their zero draft on napkins. I know a writer who likes to go to coffee shops and he'll just scribble stuff down on napkins and then he takes those napkins back to his desk and looks at them. Others use Post-its. Whatever works for you can be really helpful, and sometimes that zero drafting helps you lower your standards a little bit, which sounds weird, but sometimes as writers, myself included, I'm a little bit of a perfectionist, and so a lot of times I will think, well, I've got to write this beautiful piece that is super amazing and wonderful, it doesn't have any mistakes, and that is beautifully written, and I have to write it in 30 minutes. And so I think that setting such high expectations for ourselves actually paralyzes us, and it takes us longer to write when we look at it that way, and it also sort of inhibits us. It makes us feel like we have such high standards that we really can't meet them. And so Strunk and White in the Elements of Style, in one of the pages, they talk about building either a pup tent or a cathedral. So you could think about a pup tent maybe being a sonnet, right? And a cathedral being this epic lawn poem. And so a lot of times when I'm pressed for time and I need to write something really quickly, I think, okay, what's my pup tent? You know, I don't have to write this piece that is this huge, grandiose cathedral that's gonna stand the test of time. I could write a pup tent, so to speak. And pup tents can still be strong and sturdy and well-built. And so I think that sometimes readjusting your expectations for yourself can actually help you to write more quickly and help to lower some of those barriers to entry when we're experiencing writer's block or when we're finding that procrastination is just really getting in the way. So to recap, thinking about speed in your writing, if you want to try to get faster, think about procrastination as rehearsal. Don't report and write. Try to marry those two together so you're writing while reporting. Find that focus while you're in the field. Again, thinking about writing with your hand, head, heart, hands, and those feet out in the field. Annotate your notes as you're taking them, and write earlier than you think you can with zero drafting. And then don't always feel like you need to kind of build that cathedral, so to speak. And then how can I make my work shorter and better? So I've often found that it's harder to write short than it is to write long, right? And I, as a writer, have always had the tendency to write really long pieces or sentences. And for the longest time, I always thought that the longer the story was, the better it was, because so many of the pieces that I liked were these long-form narrative pieces, which often are beautifully written and really well done. But you can write incredibly beautifully written short pieces under deadline and stories that will ultimately resonate with people. So again, this idea of not equating news value with length. There's a great feature series in the Tampa Bay Times called Encounters, and the Encounters series comes out every once in a while, usually a couple times a month. And they're these beautifully written pieces by the Enterprise team at the Times, and they write these beautiful stories that are typically about 500 words or less. And I always like to look for them because they're always great examples and inspiration to me as a writer to think about how I can tell a conveying story in a very short space. And so this piece was published at the height of the Me Too movement, in which Lisa Gardner, the reporter, talked with a gynecologist about the victims and the sexual assault cases that she had seen in her history as a gynecologist. But the writing was just beautiful, and I loved how she was able to tell this really compelling story in a very short span of time and in less than 500 words. So I would encourage you to Google the Encounters series. Another good tip is to collect good examples of short writing and share and discuss them to learn how they work. So one of the keys to being a good writer is to read, write, and talk about reading and writing. So I think sometimes we lose sight of that third one, and that's incredibly important and critical to developing good writing skills, is to talk about reading and writing, right? So we probably did that in school. If you were in journalism school or even in English classes, you're talking a lot about reading and writing. But sometimes in the newsroom, we don't talk about it as much, especially if we don't have the best editors or we just feel like we don't have time to really talk about our writing. But collecting good examples for inspiration is so helpful. I have a Google Doc where I just keep links to all these stories that I really find inspiring. And so sometimes if I'm just stuck and I need a good lead, I think, okay, I'm gonna go to these stories, and it's this repository of pieces that help serve as inspiration to me. And I also try to talk with people. So I have found allies in my different workplaces and newsrooms who I can talk to and say, hey, what do you think about this piece? Or, oh, did you read that story in the Post last week? And so talking about it helps strengthen those writing muscles. Cut big and then small. So I don't know about you all, but a lot of times when I'm editing a story, I have to sit on my hands because I start reading the story and then I start finding all these little typos and I start to correct those first. If I literally sit on my hands, then I tend to think about the bigger picture of the story. Sometimes it helps to just read that story first without touching it, right? Because we have a tendency to try to be our own worst enemies by finding all the mistakes that are in a story. So a lot of times, if you want to make your work shorter, you can think about, how do I cut it big and then small? So if you think about it with that mentality, you can think about how you can cut out paragraphs and sentences and words and phrases that really don't lend any additional value to a story. Then once you've done that and you've pruned kind of those dead limbs, then you can look to find the typos and the smaller things that need correcting. Practice on Twitter. So I was an early adopter of Twitter, joined in 2007 before most newsrooms were on Twitter. At the time, the New York Times had only about 400 Twitter followers. And I wrote this piece for Poynter at the time, and the lead was, I never thought I'd be a Twitterer who Twittered tweets. And I definitely didn't know the word tweeted at that point. It wasn't part of the lexicon yet. And a lot of times at that moment in time, journalists were writing to me saying, why would you ever promote a tool that no one's going to use? And it's obviously interesting to see how things have changed since then. But I found that as a writer, Twitter was a really powerful tool for me to tighten my writing. And short writing can be very vigorous and powerful, and sometimes with Twitter you realize, well, I've got this short character length, how do I convey what I want to say in the shortest way possible? And so a lot of times when I tweet, I think about, how do I craft this sentence in such a way that I can make every word count, almost literally, right, because of the character limit. And one of my favorite writers on Twitter is Frank Bruni, New York Times columnist and author, and he is super witty on Twitter, and he writes beautifully in all of his tweets, and so I often look to him for inspiration. So when you write headlines, remember SEO, search engine optimization, but also think about SVO, kind of a different twist on that. So subject, verb, object. And so you want to think about putting that subject, verb, object in headlines to make them more powerful and poignant. So I want you to think about good writing, not just in terms of the stories you tell, but also in terms of the tweets that you're sharing and your headlines as well. And then bonus is that if you're an editor, be a coach, not a fixer, right? A coach, not a fixer. So how many of you would consider yourselves a writing coach? I don't know how many of you are editors. Okay. How many of you are fixers or recovering fixers? Okay. So there's an important distinction, right? So a lot of times we think, oh, well, this reporter is just, making all these mistakes. I'm just going to fix this copy. I'm going to edit it myself, make all the changes myself. It's going to save me time, right? And fixing does save you time in the short run, but it actually is much more time intensive in the long run. So I was a fixer for a really long time as an editor, where I just would end up fixing a copy myself because I thought, well, I could make this stronger. And I realized I had to leave my ego out of it. The best editors really empower their writers by coaching them and letting them know, okay, this maybe didn't work, this lead sentence didn't work so well. How might we be able to strengthen it? And coaches ask genuine questions, which then empower the writer to think about the answers themselves and incorporate them into the text. And so it may be easy to say, well, I'm a fixer and all my writers know that. But our behaviors and recognizing our behaviors explains us, but it doesn't excuse us, right? So it's really helpful to think about how you can identify editors in the newsroom who can be coaches for you, even if your direct editor isn't a coach, and how, as editors, you can think about being more of a coach than a fixer. One of my former colleagues at the Poynter Institute, Jill Geisler, she's written a lot about coaching versus fixing in her book, What Great Bosses Know. And it's applicable to all different fields, but especially so in writing and journalism. So it's really helpful to think about how you can be that coach rather than trying to fix copy, because coaching empowers the writer and does save you time in the long run, because you realize that as you're teaching that writer, they're learning and they're less likely to make that mistake again if you're coaching them along the way. So again, how do I make my work shorter and better? Think about not equating news value with length, collecting good examples of short writing, and sharing and discussing them with other people. So finding those allies or friends, even if it's a spouse, who you can talk to about your writing. Cut big and then small, practicing on Twitter, and thinking about SEO and SVO when you're writing headlines. So there's also this bigger question, which is kind of looking at the bigger picture of what's the relationship between the writing and reporting craft and the fulfillment of your journalistic mission and purpose. And I was, as I mentioned, teaching a group of young students earlier this morning who are just very early on in their reporting. They're freshmen. They're still trying to figure out if they want to be in journalism. And what I saw in the audience was a lot of excitement and eagerness and just this real desire to pursue this field, which made me super happy just to see how many of these young journalists, there are about 120 of them, were really engaged and interested in learning and becoming better at what they do. I think sometimes the longer we're in the fields, the more we sometimes forget about why we got into the field in the first place. We're distracted by buyouts and cutbacks and layoffs, and we wonder, is this field really for us? And so I think thinking back to this question of what's that relationship between my writing and the fulfillment of my journalistic mission and purpose is an important one. And for some of us, it may mean that journalism isn't fulfilling that purpose anymore. So maybe we move on to a different role in the newsroom or to a different organization where we're still able to use our writing skills. And that's the beauty of writing, I think, is that we're always writing. You know, if we're a writer at heart, then we'll always be a writer, right? So a lot of the writing that I do now is grant writing, which I thought would be super boring and that I would just hate. But I've actually been able to incorporate some of these tips and tools into grant writing. And I've realized that grant writing and proposals and reports don't have to be dull and boring. They actually can be full of life and actually can lead to some dollars as well. So think about this question. I interviewed William Zinsser a few years back. He has since passed away, but he's a great writing coach who wrote this famous book on writing, which a lot of you probably know. And one of the things he told me was that all writing to me is a journey. It's saying to the reader, come with me, I'll take you on a voyage. And I tend to think about writing as a voyage. It's a voyage that you take as the writer, and it's also a way for you to take the reader on a voyage, on a path. To discovery, to understanding, to fulfillment. And I think that, you know, at the heart of any good story is this idea that stories connect us. They're part of what make us human. They've stood the test of time. And so I think that thinking about, you know, storytelling and our journey as storytellers is important. And then lastly, Mary Oliver, she's one of my favorite poets, and she has this piece about instructions for living a life. It's very simple, but as I read it recently, I thought, wow, this is actually quite applicable to journalism and to good writing. And she says, pay attention, be astonished, tell about it. Again, we've got that magic number 3, right? And I think that middle one is super important, be astonished. Because sometimes, if we've been jaded by the field or we've been in it for a long time, we may lose that sense of astonishment, that sense of curiosity that drives good storytelling. And so think about that as you are in the field reporting and trying to strengthen your writing and the way that you tell stories. So I want to leave a few minutes for questions, but I also want to encourage you all to tweet at me and to email me. I'm happy to share additional tips with you, and I really am so happy to be here. I'm sad that Roy couldn't join us. He is very musically inclined and wanted to bring his guitar and have dance parties and a dance contest, but unfortunately he is not here with us right now. But he did bring a couple of copies of his books, and he said, well, if there's anyone in the audience who really wants to dance, then you can give them copies of my book. And so I said, okay, well, that might be a little awkward, but sure, I'll see if anyone wants to dance up here and get a free copy of the book. So if anyone would like to, woo, good shimmy. You're welcome. Any other partakers? All right, show us your dance moves. Woo! Oh, wow, nice. Oh, a dip too, thank you. Perfect. Oh, that was wonderful. Thank you. All right, that was a tough act to follow. I love it, the hair makes it too, it's perfect. Oh, thank you guys so much. Well, that was wonderful. Any questions at all or any thoughts that anyone wanted to share? Yes.
As an editor and a writer, what do you think about talking to the editor before writing anything?
Yes, so that is super important. So the question was, as an editor, writer, what do you think about talking to the writer before the writing process? And I think that's one of the key things that coaches do. So it's super important to do front-end editing, as we call it. So talking with writers about the story on the front end. So often, a reporter will write a story, and then they send it to their editor, and the editor probably knew about the story, but didn't have conversations with the writer ahead of time. And so those conversations can really help a reporter to identify potentially the focus of a story, but also help them to shape their questions, to think more deeply about how they're going to approach their reporting. So that front-end editing can actually save you quite a bit of time on the back end if you're having those conversations with the writers early on in the process.
I had a writing coach named Robert Cormier, who developed the Lion Machines and a ton of other young adult books. One of the things that he talked about in his telegram was let the readers visualize, but don't tell them what something looks like. In other words, don't describe a White House with lots of trimming as a wedding cake. Describe the White House that has lots of trimming, and let them come to a conclusion in their mind. Oh, it looks like a wedding cake, or it looks like something else. And I see so many news stories that don't have any painting.
Yeah.
I think you need to think about painting as well as writing, or think of painting when you're writing. I think that if you can let the reader instantly see kind of like the video in your head of your print story, they'll remember it and they'll want to read more.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think it also speaks to this idea of leaving some things up for interpretation, so not painting necessarily, every little detail. Sometimes artwork, and writing as a form of art can be up for interpretation. So giving the reader enough details so that they can paint a picture of their own of what something looked like without, dumbing down a piece, so to speak. So yeah, I think that's a really good point. And did you say Worcester Telegram? Or yeah, okay, I used to intern there. Grew up in Massachusetts, so.
That's really loud. Do you ever find yourself being really repetitive? Like, it doesn't seem repetitive when you're writing it, but then when you read it back, you're like, oh, I said that like 3 times. And I find that I do that a lot, and I don't know how to stop doing that.
Yeah, do you mean certain phrases that you'll repeat in certain words?
Yeah, or maybe I'll make the same point in different ways, but I don't notice it until I read it back, and I'm like, I'm not really saying anything new. It sounds interesting when you're writing it, but when you read it back, you're like, I already said that.
Yeah, I think that reading stories out loud can really help with that because sometimes you're more cognizant of it when you actually hear it. And other times you want to think about that tip of cutting big and then small. So thinking about what in this story is not adding value, what is repetitive, what's excessive, and cutting it out that way. Another thing that I do too is a lot of times if I am trying to tell a story and I feel like I'm falling into old habits or patterns, I'll just tell my husband about it and I'll say, hey, listen to this story. And so I'll tell him this story that I want to ultimately write. And that process of telling it makes it more conversational and sometimes even helps me find the focus because usually if you're telling a story orally, you want to kind of get to the point faster and you want to convey the most compelling details. So.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Rochelle?
With apologies to any editors in the audience, we have lots of these sessions on how to be a better writer. Are there anything like this that Cornell or universities offer to make editors better editors?
Yes.
This is just for the ones who need to be, who you want to get out of the way so you can do all these things that you're talking to us about. Because sometimes they tend to want to do the formula or they'll say, this sentence is way too long and they want it to be short, not because it's better writing, but because they just, those types of things.
Yes, yeah. So Pointer does offer some sessions for editors, some in-person training sessions, and then they also have a leadership academy, and oftentimes editors will attend that just because they talk about leadership skills and also editing as part of that. And yeah, I mean, I think about editing too, and I didn't really have time to get into all of this, but I always like this quote because it says, the work of a good editor, like the work of a good teacher, does not reveal itself directly. It's reflected in the accomplishment of others. And so I think that that's really important to keep in mind as an editor because a lot of times we think about trying to make a story better ourselves, but the best writers are preserving people's voices and they're helping other people shine.
And I also wanted to offer a bit of advice to the young lady who just stood up and asked. I write a newspaper column, which is a little different, but I'll write some sentence that I know is like a kick-ass sentence. It's like, oh, this has to make it, and I'll put it at the top of the column. So then when I finish the column and I read through it, and I'll see, oh, well, I want to write it this way, the way I said it in the little gray sentence, so I can't keep it this way. That's how I sometimes catch different points. So if you know there's something that's great that you want to use, hold on to it and put it at the top of your page. And then you try to say it 2 or 3 different ways. Remind yourself at the top, wait a minute, this is the best.
Yeah, it's a very good tip. I like that. Anyone else? Well, thank you so much, everyone. This was great. And truly, do feel free to get in touch if you have any follow-up questions or if you want me to send you any of these examples. I'd be happy to help. Hi.
From the American Statesman.
Oh, hi. Good. How are you?
So are you